everybody. Welcome to the event tonight. Great to see everybody here for tonight's panel discussion of questions or conformity, reading rights for the right to learn. My name's Anthony Furey. I'll be the moderator, and we'd like to thank, before we start, the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship for their generous support funding this evening's event. I'd like to introduce the panelists first, but before that, I want to let you know that what we'll do is we will have a panel discussion where we'll have some questions and our experts will discuss various matters, and then we'll put it over to you guys for a Q&A period. Towards the end of that, there's a microphone right there. If you want to ask some questions at that time, please do so. Beside me here is Robert Thomas. Robert is a subject librarian at the University of Regina Library. He's been there since 2009. He has been on the board of the Society of Academic Freedom and Scholarship since 2019. Amy Girard is a public library worker in BC. Joanna Szurmak is a librarian who is currently interim head of public services and outreach at the University of Toronto Mississauga campus. And Todd Kyle is CEO of the Brampton Library. And he's the former chair of the Canadian Federation of Library Associations and a member of the Centre for Free Expression's Working Group on Intellectual Freedom. We got a lot of territory and a lot of subjects we can explore right now. I first wanted to ask everybody about the title of this evening's event and what some of these terms mean to you. Reading rights for the right to learn. What those phrases mean, what reading rights are, what the right to learn is in the context of your expertise in the realm of libraries. Robert.
Well, thank you very much, Anthony. I think one of the things, in order to explore ideas, to delve into topics, you need a variety of different information sources available to you, quality information sources preferably. But a lot of that is what exactly is quality is contentious. You need to be able to delve for yourself between a variety of different ideas, arguments, ideologies in order to come to your own a reasoned opinion of your own on these topics. And if you don't have those available to you, you're sort of deprived of creating a better understanding for yourself.
And I know we said we weren't going to do everything where it's like a question and you sort of go through the line. It's going to be more free-flowing conversation, but I think for this first one, I will ask everybody to do it that way, to sort of all tackle this question initially. Amy.
Yeah, for me, reading rights for the right to learn is about, I strongly believe everyone should be able to read what they want to read. You're not going to be able to possibly predict what one person needs, what every one person needs. And being able to access information encourages your passion to learn. And I think it's really important to protect that.
Joanna?
So I'm a bit of a dinosaur because I like to go back to foundational documents. And for me, one of the foundational documents here is something that somehow escaped being gutted in the last few years. It's the ALA Universal Right to Free Expression. So reading rights and rights of learning or to learn go right back to that. And that universal right to free expression is an interpretation of what they call I want to get their words right, Library Bill of Rights. And it goes to a Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Inalienable Rights, specifically Article 19, the right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media. They go on and say this. I'm just going to read this. It's probably the last time I'm going to read anything this coherent today. Everyone benefits when each individual is treated with respect, and ideas and information are freely shared, openly debated, and vigorously tested in the market of public experience. They actually use those words, market of public experience. My colleagues would faint had they been able to find this document. By the way, originated in 1991, revised in 2014, and mercifully forgotten. There's one more thing I want to say. There's no good censorship. They actually say this. and I firmly believe this. This is part of reading rights for me. There is no good censorship. Why? Because a society that does not respect the privacy of the individual will be blind to the erosion of its rights and its liberties. Amen. Strike that last part.
So I agree with obviously with all of my colleagues. I'm a voracious reader myself, and one of the things that personally, strikes my fancy is the ability to read points of view that I don't agree with, and therefore to refine and hone in on perhaps what might be a truth or what might be a consensus that's evolving. I think it's really important to put this in the context not just of rights or of libraries, but in the context of the history of Western civilization. So one of the reasons why we've been able to make so much progress, and as Steven Pinker says, we live in the best time that has ever been, right? Despite perhaps wars and pandemics. The reason why we've been able to get here goes back to that Enlightenment value of being able to share things freely, criticize what others say, putting it through the filter of academia and public knowledge and editing and testing and falsifying in some cases to arrive at something that is, and I don't know if I want to use the word truth, but the word that is a knowledge consensus. So there are certain things that we eventually agree on because they've been tested so many times. It's never been well served by trying to shut up a particular point of view. Right? If the point of view isn't supported by evidence or isn't going to lead us to better solutions, then it will eventually be, not maybe die out, but it will be superseded. Thank you.
If you can indulge me, and I can go back and ask another sort of really rudimentary question, which is I know, and we talked about this before, that each of you represents a slightly different position in the library world, libraries and universities, public libraries. And what is a library and what is a library's function? And I don't, maybe that means something different from what was it supposed to be when it was first created, or different models of it, and what does it mean now? But I guess, what does a library mean to you right now, Robert?
Okay, one part of a library is just that it's a repository of information. So there's books at a library, there's maybe still some journals, mostly not. But the other part of a library is that it provides access to information. So librarians, a lot of our work is connecting clients with the information that they're seeking. So you have to talk to somebody who's looking for something. You have to decide what they really want. So many people are really bad at expressing, they know what they want somewhere inside their head, but actually expressing it, I feel the same way often, but actually expressing what they want is difficult in a way that you can assist them, so you have to get them to explain it to you, and then you help them with various methods, searching databases, finding specific books, saying, did you look at this particular source, maybe an archival source or whatnot, and then by doing that, you help them find with the information that they need for the question they're interested in answering for themselves. That's the basic, I would say.
Todd, I know at public libraries we increasingly see a variety of activities and opportunities and things to do and ways to access the library. How do you think of what a library is when you're thinking of the future of the Brampton Library, of the different services the branches provide?
So one of the things in public libraries that really is emerging now, especially as we face, I guess you'll say, competition or so from the internet and the changing information ecosystem, is the way in which a public library in particular is positioned to give people tools, not to feed them anything, but to give them tools in order to meet the challenges of a very knowledge-based economy. And that's all the way from providing internet access and the technology to the information resources. And when I think about what a library does, especially where we are in 2022, and you contrast it with this really huge information ecosystem that we have, which is the internet and in particular social media, and what is the distinction? And the distinction tends to be is that, well, for starters, as people have often said, social media is like a fire hose of information, but in particular, it is an ecosystem that encourages all sorts of actors to do things that really don't actually contribute in a constructive manner or in an earnest manner, in fact, to the production of knowledge. Instead, what they're doing, and pardon the expression, but they're flooding the zone with shit, right? That's a Steve Bannon quote. That's what he does, right? So instead of actually trying to say, here's what I believe, here's the evidence, judge it for yourself, what is often happening is they're throwing things out to see what sticks. They don't actually believe any of it, right? Stephen Bannon really doesn't believe some of the things that he says. And what he's doing is he's just throwing things out there in order to make you question what truth really is. So rather than an opinion, which may be an offensive or a controversial opinion, supported or not by evidence, they're throwing out things to make you question what you maybe have understood as the consensus or the reality. And so that I do see as a bit of a distinction, because people today need those tools to help them make those distinctions, not by telling them what information is right, but by giving them the skills.
And when we talk about the title of the event, Reading Rights for the Right to Learn, Amy, would you say reading rights are under threat right now, or they're being scaled back, that there's an urgent reason to talk about them right now?
I think there is an urgent reason to talk about reading rights. I was surprised when I got into library work. I always thought, like, oh, the library, that's the place that's really supporting people to, the right to just access information, and there's going to be a wide variety of information, all sorts of viewpoints. It's very neutral, and you just go in and find what you need. And then I was surprised to learn that there is like a movement in the library community to restrict intellectual freedom. And to me, that reading rights are threatened if anyone is thinking of restricting them. Yeah.
How would you describe that movement? How big is it? Is it a small number of people? Is it people who are more the gatekeepers of the system?
I really don't know. I have no idea. I just know that there was some things that happened, like there was an open letter sent to the CFLA, I believe last year or the year before, and a bunch of library workers across the country signed their names to it, and they were asking for, it seemed to me that they were asking for steps that would, in essence, restrict people's reading rights, and also other, it's not just reading rights because it's the library. That's also your right to hear speakers that rent the rooms or that sort of thing. So that's pretty big in my opinion. If that came up, then it makes you wonder. Also, different libraries, like in my province of British Columbia, every library, I believe, reviews their intellectual freedom policies. It's just a procedure, correct me if I'm wrong. So our provincial association is right now reviewing that intellectual freedom policy, for example. So what's gonna happen, you need to, people need to speak up and say, this is what I value. So.
And Joanna, I know we're gonna dive probably more in depth into some of these points that have been brought up, but Todd and Amy, coming from the public library perspective, what is the distinction between a university library system and are the issues, in what way are the concerns the same, in what way are they different?
That's a really good question. I have to also say that as a caveat, I've spent most of my life as a research librarian, so I've seen more the inside part of what happened, let's say the inside layers of that onion, as opposed to more of what does that look like to the users. I was, if anything, I was more on the inside, being one of the people who could possibly control access. And what I would see occasionally, and this is a good question, Anthony, because these kinds of movements towards controlling, rewriting, or rerouting access to information come from various places, but they very often come from my colleagues. I tend to get messages through various listservs, or get messages from colleagues from other parts of my organization telling me and other selectors in the areas that we have a quote-unquote gross book in our slips. So we select books to purchase for the library collection from what is known as slips. And we are told, or at least we're encouraged by this colleague, not to buy the gross book because it's going to be offensive. So in that way, there is this movement to restrict access of the university community to books. And then I have to sometimes pause and ask my colleagues who come to me and ask me, well, what should we do? To whom, why is this book gross? To whom would it be offensive? And before we decide what we're going to do with it, who do you think would find that book productive for academic study, right? In other words, what are reasons for and against banning this book? And reasons for are always tied to an issue that actually Amy and Robert brought up in preparation to this, and we just chatted with Todd about this. This huge weight of empathy. Like, we have to have empathy for the feelings of our readers and possibly those who study these books at this level. Therefore, we should be thinking of banning them. So to return to the question, what do I see? I see a lot of ideological and activist behavior in a place that, at least to me, and going back to the principles I've shared with you that animate me every day, should be neutral, right? So the selection should be strictly about, does it fit the scholarly mandate of that particular program? Is the quality on par with other scholarly materials? That's it. Am I addressing the question? Because I think I did get at something I wanted to say, but that's not necessarily something that you were asking. So just make sure I'm not doing too much of that. Mm-hmm.
Robert, what do we do about the gross book question then? Because there's only so many books you can have in a library, and there's got to be some discriminating taste for what's in and what's not, even if it's simply picking numbers or names out of a hat. How does the voice of the community, either their support for a book or their revulsion of a book, play into that then?
Well, I think as librarians, we shouldn't be choosing resources based on a moral judgment about a book or about ideas that may be contained in those books. And I think I don't think people would really like the idea of that they're morally judging something, but that frequently is something that goes on within libraries. Ideas, that are certainly in today's environment, ideas, for example, that are racist or some other sort of attack some other sort of identity group are seen as beyond the pale, that you should avoid them in the collection. And on one level, this type of judgment makes sense. Nobody really wants a racist book or however you wanted to say that. But a lot of this judgment, of course, is something that people make. A book isn't racist in itself. It's something that you would judge a book to be. And it's part of that judgment that a librarian may want to do. Another person reading it may get, an entirely different view of that particular resource. And that's why I think librarians have to judge books not on moral criteria, but rather on other criteria. So for example, where I am, does a book fit the collection, for starters? So we don't have a very strong law collection, so we wouldn't buy necessarily a law book. The Sociology of Canada would be, you'd have to have a pretty good reason not to buy a book at our library if it's on the Sociology of Canada. We buy everything Canadian. essentially, just because of our size. We can afford it. America, well, you know, we really pick and choose that type of thing. Things like, you know, the publisher, sometimes the cost of a book comes into play, where my belief is the more expensive a book is, the less likely anybody will read it. And there is a reason for this, because book publishers essentially don't print many copies of a book of books that are not going to be very popular, but that pushes up the actual per item cost of the book. So you can actually judge a book based on like the price tag. Oh, this book costs $100 US, probably nobody will read it. And you're actually correct, like, you know, 8 times out of 10 at least for that. You know, the author, who the author is. Are they a good author? Do they have publications? Are they connected to some like organization that give them a type of?
But you buy the expensive book anyway when you know no one's going to read it?
I would buy it if I think it would. Well, it depends. Like if a professor is going to use it in a class, then 100%. But if I feel like it's going to be important, I will buy it. But these are there's many different things, like the publisher, the subject matter, how it fits in the collection. You know, do we have 100 books on this topic, or is this a topic where there's 3 books in the collection, but a lot of students want to read about it? So this type of.
But to go back to the gross book question,
yeah.
So I assume, I don't know how it works, but there's only so many that fit on the shelf, and then you got to retire some to the stacks or however it works. So you got to get rid of 5 of them. What's the thought process? What are the 5 I take off? Because I know this one got some letters to the editor because it's a naughty book. So do I take that one off? You know, that probably comes front of mind when you think of the few that you've got to take off for whatever reason.
Honestly, just because of the way where I work, what we do where I work is, if a book is falling apart, I usually remove it from the shelf. So
morally or just physically falling?
No, like physically falling apart. And it also depends on how much has been taken out as well. Right. So books that are older generally get pulled, which isn't a really moral type question or dirty book question. Sometimes dirty books are actually interesting in and of themselves. We have a book that denies the Armenian genocide, for example, in our collection. And I always wonder why exactly it's there, but every time I read it, I think, wow, you know, this is such a horrible book. It deserves to be in the collection. Just because, you know, I pull it out occasionally and show people, look, there's this awful book which has awful arguments that I think are useful to actually go and you know read. You know, if you want to know bad arguments, this is a good book for it. We have another book that claims that is a really bad book that I really want to remove, that claims that the Chinese discovered America. It was really popular around 2008. It's like 1450 something or whatever. And it's supposed to be a history book, but it's really just a work of fiction. So to me, this type of thing is like...
And you want to remove it because it's factually wrong?
Well, it's completely factually wrong. I mean, he uses evidence that in other contexts has been used to prove that aliens populated America in the beginning. It has like nothing, like there's nothing in it that actually scholarly, and I never bought it, but in any case, it's in the collection. But I leave it because, you know, I don't know, I don't really feel, unless there's an actual like pressing issue to remove books, I generally don't do it. Like the book's falling apart, which does happen.
And Todd, is the pressing issue sometimes that people are getting in arms about it? You know, the Armenian genocide denying book has been on the shelves for 20 years. To Robert's point, you bring it out, you kind of laugh at it, you go, whatever, and then someone comes around, finds it, let's make a scene about this. And you go, all right, fine, I'll remove it anyway. Or do you say, well, no, it's been here for 20 years, we're keeping it?
Well, like most public libraries, there is, and I think someone already pointed it out, there's a process involved, right? There is actually a form called a reconsideration form in most public libraries. So we want to formalize that objection that somebody might have. A review committee is struck to look at the content. To me, the question always becomes, when we look at the criteria that we use for selection, in our library, and there, many of them are the things that Robert mentioned. In a public library, they might be slightly different. It's not necessarily about supporting the scholarly activity, but there is about the, does it meet the interests and needs of the community? What is the authority, perhaps, of the information, or the publisher or the author? Reviews, all those kinds of things. So put all those together, and looking at that, if we know what we know now, would we have made the decision to purchase then? Is sometimes part of the question, or has it outlived its usefulness because of what we have learned in the meantime? And there's many factors, and demand in public libraries, demand drives a lot of things. Demand is one of them. I was involved in a challenge for a book, and pardon me, I can't recall the title of it, but it's James Dobson, who's involved with an American parenting organization called Focus on the Family. The book, written in about the 90s, advocated corporal punishment, and it actually advocated corporal punishment for kids as young as 18 months. And the person who objected, who just happened to be a child and youth studies student, said that, well, the Supreme Court of Canada just ruled that under the age of 24 months, it probably would be criminally wrong. So you have to remove that book. And in fact, we made the decision to retain it. And we retained it because, well, first and foremost, it was an American book, so he wasn't actually violating any American court decision in advocating that. Obviously, time had passed. Supreme Court decisions are not permanent. And there was the point that, like him or not, and I don't particularly like him, his books were seen as an authority by parents on certain issues, and particularly conservative point of view. So you put all those things together, and you look at the balance of the things that caused you to purchase it and maintain it, and maybe it has really outlived its usefulness, but maybe it hasn't.
You alluded to that book, parents finding some value in it. There's a famous example. This new Dave Chappelle Netflix special is super popular, has like 100% rating. Everybody loves it, and every critic says it's terrible. You shouldn't watch it. It needs to be taken off. So clearly, the audience has spoken. The people have spoken. Does that happen a lot in cases of controversial books, that people are saying we got to get off the shelves, but there's actually an audience that says, well, I like this, and the numbers show that?
Yeah, and I think a lot of times the kinds of things we're talking about, the sort of activism that drives it, is often a very minority of people. And they may be the experts, and they may really know, and they may really have great arguments. But yes, you cannot ignore the fact that there are people that have found it useful or found it helpful, and you bring up an excellent example. And I also think there's also the factor that once you make a big stink about a particular gross book, you're almost guaranteed to drive demand to it. Right. So that's it. I mean, this, when we talk about censorship never having worked, in fact, censorship has often had the opposite effect.
Amy, how do library workers on the front lines deal with talking to people about this? I sometimes feel like, in downtown Toronto, some of the stuff that I see that goes on in libraries that people who work in libraries have to deal with, it's like, you're kind of like first responders. I go, wow, hats off to you. In terms of people coming to you and saying, I got a problem with this book, let's talk. Does that happen? To what degree does it happen, and how do you manage that?
Oh, yeah, it can happen for sure. And then the important way to answer is to know what's the policies of your workplace. There will always be a policy on that, and then you just follow that policy. So it depends where you are.
How does it typically work? Like, someone just comes and says, I found this is offensive, we gotta get this crap out of here, I demand it be removed instantly. I'm sure that happens, that claim.
Well, one way to approach it is you just really want to hear people out and give them a voice, and let them know what their options are. If they want to have an official follow-up, I think most libraries, the way to get that is to do a request for a reconsideration form. So you would just inform them, like thank you for your feedback. I can pass that on. If you want to ensure a follow-up, this is the process, the request for reconsideration form, and then we will definitely follow up for you. So most people won't actually engage in that official process, but you've given them that opportunity so they can make a choice. So.
Joanna, you mentioned just throughout, your career watching this issue, and we're talking now about this issue being of concern right now. Is it ebb and flowing? Is it worse than ever? We can look back and see images of book burning throughout history. I'm sure at the Library of Alexandria, somebody caused a stink and they got in a little fist fight there. And the movie Footloose is turning 40 years old. There's some book burning scenes in there. Like, where are we at right now in terms of the ups and downs of people, politicizing their libraries, making issues of what's in the volumes?
Another great question. Where are we now? I think to some extent it's perhaps one of the million-dollar questions of our time. And not only where are we now, but how can we gauge where we are if we have so few places where we can meet in common and discuss facts that we all accept as facts, or even the fact that facts exist, right? There are many of my colleagues who dispute the entire notion of facts, or that we can have a shared truth, right? So when it comes to that being a problem, and that's actually something that great book that Todd brought here talks about. It talks about knowledge production, right? There have always been trends in the area of knowledge production that tend to atomize communities, that tend to atomize knowledge producers. So that has always been there. But to what extent has that kind of seeped into the mainstream, and to what extent have people felt that there is no shared communal space? Perhaps we're at a low point. Perhaps we're at an ebb. And I think a symptom of that are the various attempts to censor our town square, which is social media. To many people, this is perhaps the last remaining place where we can communicate or attempt to communicate. To put it differently, or to maybe not give a firm answer to a question, which I don't think has a firm answer yet, is the more it changes, the more it's the same thing. And it takes me back to one of my intellectual heroes, so plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. I'm not going to cite it, but I'm going to give you an example that goes back to the 1930s. I'm going to take us back to 1930s Poland. There is a Polish Jewish scientist involved in this. It's not going to go the way you think. He's not going to end up in the camps. What actually ends up happening is he comes up with a paradigm for knowledge creation that is then rediscovered independently, I guess, through parallel idea creation by people like Thomas Kuhn. You've probably heard of Thomas Kuhn and paradigm shift, the idea of paradigm shift, revolutions of scientific knowledge that comes into this. There are people like Robert Merton, a great sociologist of knowledge, but Ludwig Fleck, the guy I'm talking about, comes up with a system that's very similar to theirs, about 3-4 decades before they do. And what he says is what Kuhn rediscovers and what Merton kind of rediscovers too, is that we get into these closed systems of opinion, and they tenaciously shut out interlopers and those who want to break them. There's nothing new about bubbles. There's nothing new about social media bubbles. There's nothing new about the fact that we end up getting isolated in academic silos. I think maybe what's new is that we have a way to inform each other about this, and we hear about this, and it seems to us that it's more pervasive. So I think I'll rest it there, but the question is good, and I think the question needs to be brought up often.
Robert, one thing that I found interesting about the past few years with COVID-19 is we saw doctors front and center, and we got to see them arguing about different things sort of very publicly. And usually we think of doctors as this sort of just emblematic thing. We thought, they're people too, and there's these left-wing doctors and right-wing doctors, and they're arguing about this and arguing about that. Dare I suggest librarians are maybe the same, and that they're people too, and that are librarians political? And does their individual politics, left-wing individuals, right-wing individuals, does that factor into what Joanna's saying, this sort of the dynamics, the tensions, and the bubble that Joanna mentioned, the bubble of the community, is that being pushed politically one way or the other?
I would hope I would hope that people don't bring their personal politics into the workplace. However, I imagine it could be it could be a temptation for some people. Librarians tend to be very progressive, left-wing individuals for the most part. And there's been a number of studies that have proven this. Library associations tend to, particularly like the ALA, over the last 15, 20 years. And we find the same within sort of some of the arguments that go on within libraries in Canada as well. They do tend to be fairly left-leaning, and it does create a sort of bubble where everybody agrees. So I'm like the unicorn type of librarian that doesn't exist because I'm on the right. I shouldn't. Maybe they can scrub that from the transcript in case people find out. But I am on the right, and I do remember going. A colleague who has since retired in our province. The Saskatchewan Party is the right-wing party provincially, and a number of years ago they won the election, decisive victory. And she told me, I worked on that campaign, like I was a volunteer on the campaign and whatnot. And my colleague talked to me afterwards and said, the only people who vote Sask Party are people who are stupid and people who work on farms. And this is like, how horrible it is they won. But there's just an expectation at work that you believe certain things, that you're in agreement with certain ideas. And it makes it hard to discuss these things, or discuss a lot of these topics without having the caveat that, of course, that book is terrible. Of course, this book is awful, but we need to have it. And this, I think it's quite common. Whenever, we always have to start off with saying that, I disagree with so-and-so's argument. I don't want to say I don't know, or maybe since this is a library, we can say the devil's name. But somebody like Megan Murphy, for example, who caused a lot of controversy by having events at libraries. You always have to start off by saying she's a horrible person, but we have to allow different ideas in libraries or something like that. There's always this need to say that we, of course, all agree that this is true. And then after that, we can talk about, the sort of philosophical reasons why we still have to allow, Dr. Gobble's ideas in the library, all the same.
Right. Amy, would you say that's fair? Does that happen in the BC libraries?
Are you saying like in the BC libraries, is it generally like politically left type of librarianship? Is that the question?
Yeah, to Robert's point about the general assumption that you have to all, qualify. Yes, this book by Bill O'Reilly is atrocious, but we're going to keep it here, kind of thing. And that's sort of everybody must kind of say that as their opening gambit.
Well, I mean, in my opinion, that would be true. I think generally, whenever conversations come up, like people tend to come from like quite a left-leaning viewpoint, and will say, it's interesting because I mean, there's books do come up that are popular, and then it's like, well, you might talk about it like, well, why is it here? Why is it on the shelf? And it's hard to answer. Yeah, it does happen a lot. I know, like, I've heard people speak that it's uncomfortable to bring up their viewpoints if they're different. Like, there's sort of, I guess what I could say I've noticed the most is just there seems to be an assumption that you should hold a certain viewpoint, and there's not encouragement to voice other viewpoints, which I think is not ideal and can lead to people not being, happy at work, and it's not good for cohesion. And then it makes you wonder, well, what does the public feel when they come in to the library? Do they notice it as well? Does everybody feel welcome? That's
Am
a
I being
question I
judged
have.
when I check out that Bill O'Reilly book secretly?
Yeah.
Do I have to feel a little sheepish about doing that, or feel like I'm in an adversarial zone?
Yeah, I've had someone say to me that actually. They're like, oh, I checked out this book and it's sort of an unpopular opinion, is it's more center or right-leaning, and they're like, everyone was staring at me. I didn't feel comfortable. So they've expressed not feeling comfortable asking for the book, checking out the book, and then they're less likely to come back. So yeah, it's sad.
Yeah, Todd, how can a library system serve its community if the political views of whatever 80 or 90% of the staff are one way, which is a bit over-representative of that direction? What are the sort of checks and balances one can bring in to deal with any challenges that arise? Or would you say challenges don't arise? How does that play out?
No, I think they do, and I think you've hinted at it. It is about checks and balances, right? So the appropriate way is to approach things, and I'm not sure if the word neutral is quite the right word. We have a little difficulty with that word, but I think of it as objectivity. I think of looking at consistent criteria, and I always think that. And it's like making hiring decisions. Everything is a push and pull between your objectivity and your subjectivity. You'll never get it perfectly right. But we have to keep asking ourselves. This is why we make some of these decisions, especially with challenges. We make them in a committee, right? Because one person will always have a blind spot that they need pointed out by other people. But I think it's really important to keep asking yourself, are we making this decision based on a certain particular notion of politics, or dare I say it, even human rights, right? Because many of the people we're talking about will say to you, I'm not being political. Human rights are not negotiable. And they're right, of course, human rights are not negotiable, but sometimes they're looking at a particular conception of human rights, and somebody else has a slightly different conception of human rights. So you always have to look at it as, am I making this decision based on some particular view of politics or my political views, or am I making this decision based on these more objective criteria? Robert's already admitted his politics. I'm a bit left of center myself, and I have when I look at my profession, most of the time I'm aligned with a lot of people on certain things. Not necessarily on some of the issues we're talking about today, but I always have to question myself. We're talking earlier, about what we've been through with the pandemic and COVID and so on like that. It pains me, I will say this personally, to see that many libraries carry the book "The Real Anthony Fauci" by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. It probably borders on libel, and that's another issue. But as many of my colleagues have said to me, and it's not the Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is a horrible person, but it's the let people make the decision. The book, and this is the objective thing, the book talks about a matter that really matters to the community. It's on everyone's mind. He is well known. People are asking for it. And so just take your own opinion out of it and provide it if you think it's right for your community. And that's all you can do.
How do you deal increasingly with the fact that there's more and more books being self-published, not just by first-time authors with a limited or zero audience, but a lot of big names are now saying, I'm going to self-publish because it's in my economic interest. So I know traditionally libraries would get the catalog out from Simon & Schuster, what have you, and click which one you're going to order. And now there's this deluge of stuff, whether it's Robert F. Kennedy or just a great novelist, who are in a whole different commercial structure. How do you filter through that?
Actually, that's a difficult question. I'm not even a selection librarian. So I know that there are other tools, of course, that in public libraries we rely on a whole bunch of tools. We do rely not necessarily directly on the publishers, because that would certainly be a blind spot in terms of ignoring some of the self-published stuff and stuff like that. But we do also rely on other reviews, rely on our vendors. But that is a particularly difficult one, and it is particularly difficult when it comes to non-fiction self-published material. Fiction is one thing, but when it comes to non-fiction and you want to be able to make a judgment, say, based on a certain authoritativeness, or perhaps it's coming from an actual earnest reality-based perspective, regardless of whether it's controversial or not, or is it somebody who's not taken any particular care, and those are definitely ones that we struggle with. And I've also had experience with again, self-published nonfiction book, where at a library that I worked at, the collection policy actually said that nonfiction books that were self-published would not be acquired. And that was the reason why. I'm not saying that's a very good answer. And in fact, they had to make sure that there was an exception in there for local history, because local history typically is self-published, and you didn't want to avoid that if it was directly about your community. But it is definitely something that I would say that we struggle with. You're right.
One big issue in the news right now, getting a lot of debate in library circles and general public making news, is censorship, I don't know if that's the right term, around books involving LGBT issues. From one side, you have people who are saying this book is hypersexualized, it's meant to sexualize my children, they shouldn't be exposed to it, get it out of here. And then on the other side, you have books. I know there's one big example. There's a debate over Abigail Schreier, who's a prominent author, wrote a book called Irreversible Damage, arguing that the gender reassignment surgery and what's going on now with transgender persons is a bit of a problem for society, and sounding some critical notes on that. And then you had transgender activists saying, get that book out of here. So sort of two sides of the same coin. Robert, how do we wade through this? Who's right, who's wrong?
Well, I'm not a school librarian, because I think a lot of these issues with LGBT books being challenged are within the school system. And I feel, and I guess none of us here have any real connection to actual schools, but I think there's a number of different issues, some of which deal with intellectual freedom, some of them don't. There's an issue of stakeholder rights. Some of the people complaining really have no connection to school. I mean, they're community members. Somebody like that maybe could complain on how much of the budget gets spent on, on air conditioning or book purchases. But I think people like that really have no right to complain about what ends up in a library. But people, for example, who have children in the school may have legitimate concerns of what their children are being exposed to. And that should be, explained to them in a way that hopefully gives them. I would think that their children should have, or they should have some control over materials which may not be, age appropriate. And once again, I'm not an expert at this. I'm not sure what age appropriate is. Maybe they would have a better sense of what their children should be exposed to at a particular age. I don't know. I think there's a lot of questions with that. There's also professional issues. Librarians are professionals. They should be able to answer, what is good for their collection. So I think there's competing purposes, or sometimes cross purposes as well for those. With the Abigail Schreier, I actually know something about that, as opposed to the other where I'm just sort of spitballing, because I bought that for our library. And I actually bought a number of books that are, I would guess, gender critical would be the term, sort of a feminism that is critical of the ideology. Our library, and I must say, I buy a lot of books that are sort of heterodox on topics like this, but they're actually a very small number of the books I buy. I must spend 50,000 US or more on books every year. For our library, and this maybe makes up $200 or $500 of the books for books that are maybe a bit strange, or not very strange, but a bit some people would find questionable. I don't. With the Abigail Schreier, I chose it because it seemed to be on an issue of relevance to the university. A lot of people read about trans issues, are concerned about gender issues. Abigail Schreier herself was a graduate, I believe, of Yale. She worked for the Wall Street Journal, mainstream newspaper. The book had really good write-ups in a number of mainstream newspapers in the UK, Ireland, the US, including The Economist that chose it as Book of the Year, I believe, a couple of years ago. So it had a lot of the indicators that I usually would use for purchasing a book all said it was good. So I figured, hey, it might as well have it in the collection. It will give another perspective. So I bought it. And then somebody complained. And so they wanted to get it removed. They complained the publisher wasn't good, that it was bad for the LGBTQ plus community. And we ended up keeping it in the end. But I don't know, I think people should, there's multiple different perspectives shown at the university, not just Abigail Schreier's. There's other books that say similar things in different ways. There's other books that are on the absolute opposite end of the spectrum that we purchase for the collection. So I think though if you are pro-trans rights, you really should want, if you care a lot about it, you should want to know what the other side believes. So I think like having that there would be good. You should also want the other side to have better arguments, because they still, even if they have really sucky arguments, they have horrible arguments, embarrassing arguments, they still might win. They may win political power, they may convince politicians to enforce their policy perspectives. And if they have worse arguments, if they're even haven't really thought out very well what they're doing, they still may cause immense havoc. So to me, it's good to have the opportunity to actually explore these issues for yourself, if you're on one side, but also if you're on the other side as well, to have opportunities to think through some of the issues more carefully. And I think books like that, provide one perspective, but it's an important perspective to at least consider, even if you ultimately reject it as an idea.
Joanna, what do you think about those issues around the LGBT books being banned, whether it's because it's, whatever they say, abusive to children, or because it's abusive to the trans people? I mean, a lot of this is under the rubric of this book will harm people. Is that a thing? Can a book harm people? Does it?
One of my favorite questions. I think to start answering this, first of all, I'm going to come back to the can a book harm people in a moment, but I'd like to go back to something that Todd said, because what he set up beautifully is the idea of what should be driving selection, not just at the public book, but also at the public library level, but also for me at the academic level. And I'll talk in a second about what drives my decision, because there is a specific, let's say, matrix of choices. But the word that came to mind when Todd was speaking is tension. You don't want a flat line. You actually want a tension between views. Why? Because tension is generative. And that generative tension then allows for people to move to sides, one or the other, or somewhere else, but be able to move somewhere dynamically, right? You're feeding them. And your selection, your decision accomplishes that tightrope act that you wouldn't be able to do without that tension, right? So when I think about the selection of books like these, I think about is it supporting that tension that I would like my students to experience. And what you asked about, Anthony, is can a book harm? Well, a lot of people who don't want gross books in the collection will say that these books are tantamount to violence, that the ideas in them perpetuate violence or perpetuate hegemony or oppression or oppressive ways of being. Well, sometimes when I talk to them, I would like to remind them that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Section 2B, does not consider a book, for the most part, or ideas within a book, to qualify as violence, even though it recognizes that people may feel uncomfortable or that they may feel internally as if something was upsetting them. we're not, as a society, we cannot afford to get everybody into this static, happy feeling. We're not about propagating, the happiness from Soma. We're about having people think critically about what it is that being an adult, being alive, contributing to the society is. So when I buy books, I try to explain my choices, and I've bought, for example, the yucky book, or the gross book, pardon me, that was mentioned in the email that we go back to, is actually a Douglas Murray book on sex and gender. I bought it. I bought a bunch of his other books. Why? Because again, he argues at a fairly high level from a point of view that is often absent in the discussions that we have in the classroom. So what do I do with these books? When I manage to work with the faculty in those areas, I like to go to them and ask students, would you use this in your arguments? Why or why not? What would be the criteria that would lead you to use this book? And I typically go to academic criteria, such as the quality of the argumentation, the quality of sources, the quality of, let's say, the support of the arguments throughout the book. I want them to be able to think critically about how to work with books on both sides of that tightrope. And that really, that goes to, I think that explains how I would approach these. Now, do my colleagues tend to agree with me? No, I'm very much like Robert. I tend to have to argue for my collection selections. I mean, buying Deborah So or buying Douglas Murray is very unpopular with many of my colleagues because they choose to not have tension. They prefer stasis. I would like to think that they've sold out to a kind of naive realism about what is the world and what it is that we should be doing when we help people to learn about the world. But yeah, I think people talk themselves into believing that books can harm and that books can be violent because they've walked away from the idea that to be alive and to negotiate life in society actually does require a certain amount of wakefulness, awareness, and being able to deal with tension and uncertainty.
I wanted to ask Amy and Todd about public events in libraries, because maybe half the controversy these days about libraries is about the books, and then the other half is about the public events that go on there. I know, Robert, you referenced that saying Megan Murphy, I guess, to people in the library system is like a bit of a Voldemort name or whatever. You're not supposed to say it. Megan Murphy being a feminist who is a trans-exclusionary radical feminist, they call it. So a feminist who is not really on board with the transgender movement. I won't speak for her, but I guess she doesn't believe trans women are a part of the women collective. And she was doing a speaking tour in whatever year it was probably a while ago now, 5 or 6 years. And people didn't want that to happen. It was at libraries. Pretty much all of them were at libraries across the country, and lots of calls for them to be shut down. I remember the one in Toronto was incredibly spirited. Now we have a number of drag queen storytime hours that are taking place in libraries really from coast to coast across the country, where I've taken my children to normal story time on a Saturday, Sunday morning where they just read books, and this one is drag queens reading the books, and I think some of them are of a LGBT flavor. People don't like that, and well, some people like it and they're showing up for it, other people really don't like it and they're protesting. Todd, how do you deal with that? How do you deal with the request for public events, public space? This event, we're talking about library issues. I can understand why they said, all right, come on in, you can use the space. The other ones, how do you deal with the request? What qualifies as a library acceptable event, and how do you deal with the controversy?
Well, I mean, we have to make a distinction between an event like this, which is a rental. I mean, I'll put that out there, right? So, and the Megan Murphy events actually were along this line. So, the way to approach when you're a public institution and you make available a public meeting room is we don't have control over the content or what you're doing because you're doing it independently. So we should only be looking at criteria such as, are you going to abuse the space, or you're going to, leave a mess, or these sorts of things. Maybe you're going to serve alcohol and we don't allow that. Those sorts of things. And so we have to, I mean, those ones were relatively, maybe I'm simplifying, but those are relatively simple decisions because the events were actually at arm's length. They were within the building, but they weren't offered by the library. Where it gets more complicated, and the Drag Queen Storytime is an example, is when an event is really the library's event. So they're inviting somebody to do something, other staff is doing something, and they're publicizing it as their own event, and so on. And that's where it becomes more complex. And I think, again, like your collections, you have to go back to certain criteria. So what is our aims of the programming that we do? And what is the ability of this particular program or this particular speaker or performer to meet those aims? And what is the community need that we are meeting or not in presenting this? But Drag Queen Storytime is a particularly difficult example because the views on it are extraordinarily polarized. A library has to ask itself the question: Are we making the decision to particularly choose this program over many other things that we could choose based on some objective criteria as opposed to a particular political position? And that could be, on one end of the spectrum or on the other end of the spectrum. And typically, and I've witnessed and seen those programs. I mean, they're a professionally presented, performance-based program that certainly has an overall inclusion message, but they're not particularly politically flavored, unless you, from your perspective, are reading that into it. But it is a very difficult thing. But I think all we can do is go back to those same criteria about how we make choices, and again, in some ways, let the broader community who may show up or not help us make that decision.
Have you had to grapple with the drag queen question at the Brampton Library System?
So we've presented it, but we actually have not met with community resistance. So we've actually been.
So you've had them.
So we've had it. Okay. So we're actually quite fortunate in that regard, because that is obviously the intention is to do it because you believe it meets certain aims that you're trying to do within the community, but without causing polarized opinions and some of the terrible things that have happened in some cases in American libraries, where people have shown up to disrupt the events, and particularly concerning when it involves small children, right? But so yeah, we've been actually quite fortunate that we haven't run into that, but I obviously have colleagues that have not been so fortunate.
Yeah, Amy, there was a library in BC that was met with some protests for Drag Queen Story Hour just like a week ago. What are your thoughts on these competing issues? The Meghan Murphy, the Drag Queen one, how does it play out?
I just think it's like, everyone knows that there's protests about these events and on these issues, and they keep coming up over and over again. And I think that's just like a signal. So there's something going on, people have questions, they haven't been answered to a satisfactory extent. Like the whole, like, why do you choose this programming? Why would you host a Drag Queen Storytime? Why would you let someone, Meghan Murphy, rent your space? If the questions keep coming up, that means people haven't had an answer, like they haven't received that information. So I suspect that there just needs to be better dialogue with the community, and dialogue isn't encouraged when it's when you're going to label and criticize. So there's protests, you'll often hear it just like, oh, like shame, there's protests. Whoever's protesting is obviously a terrible person. And how does that encourage the conversation? You've already made up your mind. These people are bad people, so you're gonna miss the opportunity to find out, well, is there something of value there? What truth am I not hearing? You strongly disagree if you're gonna label like that, but there's got to be something of value in there. Like, most people are good people. If they're protesting, most people are gonna have a really good reason, and they need that opportunity to actually have that discourse. And then I think the problem would be solved, right? if it keeps coming up, then you better try a new way to approach it.
I could add something. I can't add anything about Drag Queen Story Hour. I work at a university, and it's not really an issue there. But
because they all support it, or because
one, because they all support it, and
does or
two,
doesn't happen.
it wouldn't be held at the library in any case. It would be held somewhere else. But we have a radio personality, John Gormley, in Saskatchewan. He's quite. If you live in Saskatchewan or visit it for any amount of time, you'll eventually hear him or hear somebody talking about him. But I had him come and talk about a book that he was putting out. I run events at the library at the university. I have no budget, so I'm sort of limited who can come. Basically, I need somebody who can come for free and actually wants to talk. And people who are publishing books seem to all want to talk about their books, so I have them come. So I had him come for an event to talk about his book. And it's about, essays about, there's one about his, like when his father was dying, and like it's not very, there actually wasn't particularly political, although he is. But the morning of the event, he said something about Indigenous issues on the radio. I can't remember what it was, but there was this huge protest at the library that came. There was like 20 protesters that came to the event, and they pelted him with shoes, with a plastic snake. It was actually just, it was a bizarre situation. This was a number of years ago when the Sun News Network was still on the air. So they ended up having a segment with Brian Lilly on the Sun News Network with a picture of me in the background trying to stop this guy. And the guy dressed in this funny suit with this mask on, and the whole thing was just surreal. So eventually security came and kicked them all out, but we continued with the event. But protests do happen. People should have the right to protest, but certainly people shouldn't have the right to disrupt events, because that's an essential part of intellectual freedom, is that people should be able not only to speak about things that matter, but people should also be able to listen. And if a protester comes, you're depriving both groups. If you don't like an event, just either make your own or go home. But don't come and disrupt things. So.
I know we wanted to open the floor to questions pretty soon. Before we do that, I wanted to pose one last sort of wrap question to you all, sort of a general question about, you've all kind of agreed that reading rights are a little under threat right now, and there's difficulties, there's challenges that we've identified. Do you envision things improving soon? Do you envision a situation where it's worsening? And please also take this as an opportunity to pick up on anything that we were talking about before. Todd, if you want to go first.
I'm a little bit of a pessimist on this. It concerns me, and I do worry that it is getting worse, and I think it's a reflection. I mean, this isn't about libraries, it's a reflection of society in general, about much more of a higher degree of polarization, right? So one of the things about censorship or challenges or whatever you want to call it is the fact that it really is coming from both sides. Again, just to plug this book by Jonathan Roch, he refers to the right-wing threat as the troll epistemology, and he refers to the left-wing threat as coercive conformity, otherwise known as cancel culture. And I'm a little bit concerned about the fact that we're having trouble reining both of those in and getting back to the essentials of, again, what we know from the Enlightenment and human progress over the last couple of centuries, and getting people to understand that. And in terms of just to bring it down to the level of libraries, I'm concerned about the external threat in particular and I'll just put that quote surrounded right-wing external threat, because again, the protests and concerns about LGBTQ plus themed books and drag queen story time are really becoming quite concerning, especially in the US, but it has actually spread to Canada. There's been some Canadian libraries that have received so-called legal notices that they're violating Canada's obscenity laws. Again, a fiction, but just putting that out there. And then on the other side, I'm actually concerned about the internal threats. So one of the things that I see, and we talked about this overwhelming left of center orientation of librarians. I'm seeing that and it's not necessarily a generational thing, but it's just an evolution of changes in the profession and people retiring and people becoming in positions of prominence. There is a different preponderance of opinions in terms of how they approach this, and this is why, again, having been with the Canadian Federation of Library Associations, I was always concerned about how that organization in particular, which is a federation, how its board of directors and its decision makers would change over the next few years, because the member associations would be nominating a new generation, if you will, of leaders who have a different perspective on it. So I am a little bit concerned on the broad society level and in particular in libraries. Yeah.
Joanna?
I must say I'm also concerned, but I also I would like to keep a long view, long perspective, and I think that comes back to a lot of things I've already said. Not only because I think that a lot of what we're seeing right now, however dire it is, and I do agree with Todd that there is a ton of polarization, and it's definitely on both sides. And as much as I agree with that, I also know from reading history that it's happened before. I also know that it usually gets a lot worse before it gets better, and it doesn't tend to progress very smoothly towards a peaceful resolution. It often gets very ugly, right? Doesn't it?
Yeah.
That tends to be the nature of social upheavals and revolutions. I hope it's not going entirely that way, but I think last time people were incredibly polarized. Well, it was, again, if we go back to the Age of Reason and to the Enlightenment traditions, it was coming out a little bit of that huge upheaval with the French Revolution and so forth, when some of the paradigms that were rising through what was being read and what was being made available intellectually then sort of percolated and I won't say refined themselves, but maybe overly crystallized themselves and ended up coming up with really ugly social and political outcomes. So is it necessarily going in that direction? I think we have a lot of things that we didn't have back then. Not that we're reading the history that we have. I wish that as a culture, again, we read more history, but I think that, again, as a culture, we've really splintered so that some of us end up reading history and many of us end up forgetting quite as much history as we should be internalizing and reading. But we also have social media, we have new media, and we have a lot more awareness of the things that were almost invisible in the age of mass broadcasting. We didn't realize that some of the subcultures that actually exist. We didn't realize that they produce beautiful things. We didn't realize how many voices there are that we simply couldn't hear before, because now everybody can have a podcast, and it seems like everybody does have a podcast. And some of them are good. Some of the self-published books that we talked about earlier are beautiful. Some of the art and some of the films, independent films that come out, are absolutely stunning. Some of the people that publish things on their own or on a shoestring budget, because it is so cheap and electrons are free, almost anyway, come up with absolutely beautiful things. But can we manage to pause, take it in, and to realize that we're all human? Because that seems to be a very charged political statement these days. So I think when we manage to get to the point at which we can at least agree that we are human and that maybe there are things in that shared humanity that matter more than, let's say, day-to-day certain divisions like the essentialist racial divisions or others that are being pushed by many of our colleagues and so-called thought leaders, I think we have a chance. But can we make it? I think I'm more of an optimist than Todd. I think we will, but is it going to get worse for a little while? Oh, it sure is. But it's up to us. I mean, we're here tonight because surely we believe, first of all, that this is an important question, that what libraries are doing is important, and that there is a role for all of us, right? There is a role here that all of us play in actually making that better, right? And then one of the things that I truly believe in is that, hey, this is a dinosaur idea, everybody would laugh at me, but there's something about There's something almost sacred about how libraries can collect the intellectual output of a civilization. We don't really do that anymore. But I wish we did do that more. If we do collect that output, if we reflect on that output, yeah, we can do it.
I definitely think it's under threat, for sure. One example, for example, is the Canadian Federation of Library Associations. They do intellectual freedom challenges survey. They've been doing that for 15 years. And 2021 is their most recently published survey on those challenges, and it set 2 records. So that's pretty surprising. And the records were, they received 19 challenges for a gender-critical viewpoint book, The Irreversible Damage by Abigail Schreier. So that was a record-setting number of challenges against one book. And then the second record that was set was more library workers than ever before were the ones like bringing up those challenges. So, yeah.
I'm both pessimistic and optimistic. I don't know. I think when it comes to intellectual freedom, everybody agrees, and I think this, not just now, but in the past, everybody agrees with the concept of intellectual freedom. Everybody agrees that their ideas, their opinions, their sacred beliefs, they should be able to talk about them. Even the Nazi regime believed that Nazi beliefs should be talked about in Nazi Germany. The problem is that people don't always believe that the ideas they hate, that the people they disagree with should have the same opinion or the same opportunity. And I find this even among Canadian organizations that struggle that in support of intellectual freedom. They're always having the easy sell. Oh, you group over there, you should be able to talk about what you care about. They never try to convince, for example, pro-Israel advocates that are maybe very antagonistic toward Hamas and Palestinian anti-Israel actions. You should support criticisms of Israel. They never, nobody ever pushes that. It's always pushing the idea that people who agree with an idea should be able to say it, and that group always agrees. So I think there's a lot of work that has to be done to encourage people to understand the wonders of living in a society where people can disagree, and that this is a positive thing, not only for those people, but even for ourselves, that we have more opportunities to engage with ideas, create better arguments for ourselves, find our views challenged so that we don't rest on our, rest in an echo chamber where everybody agrees with us, and therefore we can live happily in ignorance that there's an entire world out there that either doesn't understand what's going on or is antagonistic to our position. I talked, for example, to my mother sometimes about gender critical topics, and she thinks I'm crazy because I say, there's people who believe, men are women, and she's like, nobody believes that. Like, this is nuts. Like, who would ever say something like that? And I think a lot of people, fall out of this sort of echo chamber belief area. And by having more discussions, we can hopefully get a better sense of what they believe, what they need to know, maybe convince them of our point, or at least maybe see the weaknesses in our own position. And by doing so, we can maybe progress as individuals and have a better, produce better arguments for ourselves. I'm not sure if we can convince people to allow that, but I think we should try. And I think we need to push that forward, that disagreement is actually a beautiful thing, that plurality of opinion is a beautiful thing for a democratic society. And until we can convince people of that, I think this is going to be, constantly under threat, that people aren't going to want to erase hateful ideas or ideas that are phobic or what's-a-phobic or whatever the issue may be. So I think we have a lot more work to do, but I don't think it's a lost cause. But I think we need to push forward.
Great. Does anyone have any questions for our panel this evening? And please do use the microphone, because I know it's a small room, but the event is being recorded, so we'd like to be able to pick up your questions.
Hi, thank you very much. I actually have two questions, but I'll ask one now, and then if no one else gets up, I'll ask my second one. So I'm wondering, it was sort of hinted at, and I suppose being Canadian, we all want to be non-controversial and talk nicely, but where is the bigger threat coming from? Is it from the right, or is it from social justice activism? Where is the threat coming from? Because if we don't say where the threat's coming from, then it would be impossible to actually, talk about solutions. And to that point, there was mention of a petition that was circulated that many librarians, it wasn't clear where the petition was coming from and what they were asking for. So can we state that out loud in public so that we can all actually have a discussion about what we're actually talking about?
Start if you'd like. So the petition, and I think we're both referring to the same thing, Amy, is so the Canadian Federation of Library Associations put out a statement in support of libraries who defended the existence in their collection of the book Irreversible Damage by Abigail Shrier. And the open letter was effectively saying, we as a group of Canadian librarians disavow this statement, and we believe that you're simply promoting hate. So I think that pretty much clarifies it. In terms of, and sorry, the other question was in reference to which is worse, or where is it coming from? And I don't know. I mean, to quote Donald Trump, I think there's very fine people on both sides. So I don't know. It's hard to say. I mean, I think that they are both sources from a very, very different perspective. Although I occasionally have seen ones where I can't actually tell, where the objection to an idea or a book, I can't tell if they're saying that it's because they wish to deepen social justice or inclusion, or in fact if they're saying this is harmful because it is too, social justice flavored. I actually sometimes can't tell the difference. So I think they really are both equal in a sense.
Do any examples of that come to mind? I'm just curious.
I'll think about it and get back to you.
Do you ever get, I remember seeing flat earthers used to protest in front of Robarts Library when I was an undergrad, and I don't know how that works, and I don't know what they want removed or included. I find that's an interesting group, and they do show up.
Before I answer it, I went to an anti-vax protest once, just because I have a weird idea of what's fun, but there was actually an flat Earth protester there with a big, really big sign, or it was actually a shirt with the Earth is flat or something with a little website, and it was just very indicative of what I thought of anti-vax protesters. But anyways, I'm on, as I shouldn't have mentioned before, I am somewhat on the right. So I have a lot of people I know who are on the right and a lot of people on the left, and I find both sides have, I don't want to say equal, but I would suspect they're both equally censorious and illiberal when it comes to ideas that they disagree with. They both want, there's probably about the same number of people I suspect on both sides that want the other side that they disagree with to shut up and to be silent and to not have an opportunity to talk in various ways. I think the left has far more institutional power in Canada, and possibly less so in the US, but considerably so as well in the US. So they're more able to implement these sort of censorious ideas within not only within institutions, but within cultural milieu, within, be it the local knitting club. There was one of my friends online was part of a mums group, and she got kicked out because she said men couldn't get pregnant, and so she was kicked out of the local local, the local mums group in her area in BC. So I think that these type of things, there's pushes for this on both sides, but the left is holds the most power at the moment. If the right could take power, which maybe I'd be happy if that happened, then it'd be just as bad. Because I think this is not a right or left issue. It's a question of liberalism, of supporting a liberal perspective that benefits everybody, no matter what part of the political spectrum you're on.
Yeah, to the point of the question, numerically though, Joanna, Amy, is there a greater threat volume-wise from one side or the other in terms of types of volume of complaints and degree of activism?
So I do have a different perspective from Robert, because I'm in a major urban Canadian research university, and even though I'm at, let's say, a side campus, I shouldn't really call it that, but of course we are a little bit of our own institution, we do not hear, see, or sustain any criticism or any visible criticism from the right. All of ours are, let's say, organically arising from the Fleckian thought collective that has pretty well colonized or absorbed or has become the university. So that's really all we get. However, I don't even see a ton of these protests, and the saddest thing perhaps is that I wouldn't mind if either students, faculty, or others affiliated with the university protested, because that would show me that they care, and that there is, again, returning to the word tension, some kind of a tension going on. There's something at stake, and they care. The people who end up protesting are my colleagues. They're other librarians, and this is what I find most disconcerting. They are not merely on the left, which again I'm very happy with. I'm myself something of a libertarian. I'm very happy entertaining people on both sides, but these people are on the activist side, and they simply do not see a line of demarcation between what should be professionalism and some kind of, as Todd said, maybe uneasily neutrality, and where activism could start or should start. And that's my experience. Unfortunately, I can't quantify it beyond that, so that means maybe tens of examples a year, coming, about 80% of them, from inside.
Yeah, I think, and just to add to that, I think part of our problem is, from a numerical point of view, it's actually hard to be certain, because our actual information gathering tools, and the CFLA survey is one of them. Center for Free Expression is also starting a similar one. There's nothing particularly complete or scientific about them. One of the things that I always found interesting, and it's a flaw that's been corrected, is the CFLA survey actually did not ask what the library ended up doing. Did they remove the item? Did they retain the item? Many libraries, of course, volunteered that information in the free-form comments, but that to me is actually the real thing isn't how many challenges there are. The real question is how many decisions are made that actually restrict the space for thought, right? So are books removed? In the case of the sort of left-wing coercive conformity, as Jonathan Roch refers to, I think my concern is, what are all the books or ideas that simply were not entertained or were not purchased or selected because of fear? With the right-wing one, I think libraries in particular are more likely to defy that pressure. You don't like drag queen story time? We'll do one every week. Right? Like, really, I don't, and that's not even an exaggeration. I think that's how a lot of people would, and it's great. They're showing their courage. But the left-wing one, I'm more concerned that it's so closely aligned with the ideology that they already have, that it's really easy to say, yeah, I'm just not even going to look at that. I'm not going to bother. And so, what did we not acquire?
Yeah, I think as well, it's hard to say, like, what side is it coming from. Another problem is people get labeled right just because they are critical of gender. And does that mean you're right-leaning? Like, I don't think it means that. It's just, this is a new concept. It's a brand new social norm. So apparently, if you object to a brand new social norm, that means you're right-leaning. I thought that would mean that you're center. So it gets confused because of that. Additionally, I think it's like you can see the so-called right-labeled opposition. It's quite visual. The media just loves to talk about it. But you can't see the opposition. I don't think you can see the opposition that comes from progressive left because, like you guys were saying, it's really within the institution. For example, I've heard of librarians not liking the fact that on Bibliocommons, which is like where you might look to pick your book out from the library, that people can, like users can publish lists, and apparently there's some users that will publish lists that have views around COVID-19 information that would perhaps be labeled right or anti-vax or whatever. And so I've heard of some librarians have actually been like, oh, we've noticed this, we have had a complaint, and we don't like it either. Let's look into it and see what we can do about that. And I think you've really, how's the public ever gonna know that came up? They're not gonna know. And yet that's, like, in my opinion, a huge overstep. So.
Hi. That's down, sorry.
Oh, just turn the mic itself.
Oh. Hi. Hi. I have two questions, so I don't know if I can reel them off. Two separate topics. One is free speech is being attacked, it seems, in many different institutions, not only the libraries. We're seeing problems in schools, we're seeing it, workplaces. In those other areas, I know schools, parents are starting to form organizations or groups and trying to, come together to sort of combat, provide alternative views. Is there anything happening like that in the library world, particularly for, let's say, public libraries? Like, for example, we know we have Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship is an organization, but in terms of public libraries, advocating for diverse views within the literature and public libraries. What we're seeing, or I'm seeing, is a lot of books from, let's say, the left side being presented in libraries, and I'm just wondering if there's been any sort of talk or about some organizations forming to help to sort of expand, the views that are being presented in public library systems. Like advocating for free speech.
I can take an attempt at that. I mean, nominally, most library organizations that in particular that represent public libraries, nominally, this is what they believe, that there needs to be a broad diversity of viewpoints and that free speech matters. I just, as I said before, my concern is that over time that may change, but I don't think that, to my knowledge, in our world, there's quite an equivalent of, say, SAFS. There are a couple of, there are certain writers, there's blogs here and there. There's actually a blog called Heterodox Libraries. I think it's just a reference to Heterodox Academy. I don't think it's actually connected to them. But you're right in that there hasn't been quite the same emphasis within the library world as there might be within the academic world. Unless somebody knows something else, I don't know.
How does it work, if I can ask, are there citizen committees at libraries? And in the relationship from the library to the municipality, and I should know this answer, is there a board of directors like there is board of health and so on?
So in Ontario, but it varies by province, and Amy may have a different answer, but in Ontario, library boards, which must be only a minority elected officials, so only a minority of councillors, are mandated by law. And one of the reasons historically they are there is actually to make sure that, you know, the mayor doesn't call up the library and say, get rid of this book, right? And so there is a bunch of layers of governance. As many of my colleagues know, in Ontario, though, some municipalities exhibit more or less influence over the libraries because they're still the majority funders. And so, right, even here in Toronto Public Library, and Lisa, you'll know this, the mayor weighed in on the Meghan Murphy controversy. Inappropriately, in my view, but from a governance point of view. But that does happen. Generally, there is, at least nominally and legally, a degree of independence that should insulate against that. But that's Ontario.
I wanted to say, I think I totally get what you're saying. I've only heard, like personally, I'd love to hear more if people have that information. I've just recently heard of 2 groups that are collecting together to form, to encourage libraries to really like have a view that supports the entire public. And is obviously supporting the entire public instead of right now where it's kind of you walk into the library and you kind of wonder like, is there a political bias here, right? If you look at any book list the libraries are publishing or the programs they're offering, it's really quite, it seems to me politically slanted. So I've heard of, there's FAIR as an organization and they do have a libraries division. So that's one that seems more active. There's a place called the Heterodox Academy, and they have different communities. They all have a Canada community and they have a library community. So their library community, is working on that. They're newer. I know there's some members of that community that started a Substack called Heterodoxy in the Stacks.
That's what I meant.
Yeah, so they're working to promote that, and so people can look to that and see what they're working on and join, I think.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you. My second question actually kind of relates to the idea of a library board. Okay, so Hamilton had a protest last week, drag queen story time. There was a number of counter protesters that probably overshadowed the actual protesters. And of course it hits the media and the protesters' story, why they're protesting, it's obviously heavily slanted. They're not hateful people, they're just concerned about the appropriateness of the event. And it ends up with the mayor of Hamilton, the newly elected Andrea Horwath, basically calling out the protesters as hateful. So this is not, helpful. I can appreciate that we have diverse views on the issue. So I'm asking Todd and Amy, from a public library standpoint, there are people in the community who are concerned, and there's a whole discussion to be had around the appropriateness and or like whether it's legit to have like a drag queen performance for toddlers or whatever. And we're not able to have that conversation. On the one hand, the protests are useful in helping the public to even know that those story times are even happening, because I had no idea that these had been going on for years until more recently. And so on the one hand, it's getting it into the media and people are finding out about them that way. But on the other hand, it's really not doing a good job of bringing people together to be able to sit down and rationally talk about these and have these discussions. So I'm asking your advice on those community members in Hamilton, but also I know that there's, they're pretty much now happening in a lot of communities throughout the States and Canada. What would be your advice to give an outlet to those community members that are having an issue with it? What would be the best process to follow so that the voices can get heard rather than just being shut down as hateful?
It's a really tough question, and you're absolutely right. It is very hard to have a rational an evenly balanced conversation about that particular issue. But that I can't see any other way to approach it. Is there a role for a library to actually facilitate such a discussion? Dare I say debate? Perhaps that's the wrong word to use, because that could, debate could quickly turn into a fight. But I struggle with that one too as well, because on both sides of that issue, there will be people who simply refuse to listen to any other perspective, and they're very loud voices. I agree with you that it is not particularly helpful for the mayor to have said that. There's certainly a place for a political leader to say that we have the right to protest, but if there was any disruption, it's inappropriate. We have to be very careful with the feelings of children, et cetera, and that this is, but at the same time, to support the right of the library to, again, do something that they believe is right for their community, that there's demand for and interest in the community, without saying, that one side or the other is full of hate.
Do you think there's any value in, I'm sorry. Just really quickly, do you think there's any value in bringing it to the board, putting it on an agenda, going through that process?
Go ahead.
I think it's politics.
Yeah.
So I think, sorry, this is I'm wading in because I'm not a library expert, but I think what you're talking about is, the board, and that's political appointees. So if you really want to say that, these events shouldn't be happening here, those are probably the people who would direct staff, ultimately.
Could I just mention, one thing I think is important is that people see that the library represents them as individuals. And I think a lot of these very emotional, provoking incidents like Drag Queen Story Hour have the potential of making people think the library is about Drag Queen Story Hour and nothing else, because they pay no attention to the library otherwise until the actual event. I mean, I'm really bad at this. Until fairly recently, I never went to the public library, even though I'm a librarian. I work at a library. I'm at a library all the time. Why would I go to another one? But it's important that people see themselves represented in the library and its collections, et cetera. And often they'll only get part of the story, which is that, we have drag queens. They won't see other events which may be very different. And I think libraries, I think it would behoove libraries to maybe find ways of advertising these other events. Maybe they could fund a protest on some conservative group that was at the library. I don't know. Try to get it in the press, because often they don't see what else goes on at libraries. And then people think that libraries are entirely slanted against what they feel is right. And it makes people less supportive of libraries, which I think is a real threat to libraries' existence if they're not seen as a neutral venue. And instead of just this weird leftist group, I think it's a real threat to libraries' existence.
Todd, you made a really interesting, sorry, Amy.
May I add something before? I just wanted to say, I think there's a lot of value going into your local public library and just speaking to the staff. So I think it's part of myth busting, right? With staff, maybe the messaging out there is, oh, those protesters bad, they're just hateful people. So if you go, and also one of the myths is oh, they're not even from the community, they're from a different community, right? So every library values their community, right? If you go into your own library and speak with the staff, just have a discussion to sort of present well, this is my objection, this is why, or maybe I would like to see something else, and sort of just so you can have that conversation so staff grows in awareness of what the objections or criticisms are, or what is looking for that is different, and what value would that person get from it. And then in addition to that, speaking to the chief librarian, because they're in charge, just can I have a discussion? Because I think librarians they know, like, it's important to have a discussion. That's why they have that request for reconsideration form. It's because they know that that process of having a discussion offers them to learn more, and to even educate the person that's criticizing. Maybe they have something to share with you that you haven't thought of, right? And also you might share something with them they haven't thought of. And I think they would all chief librarians would value that. Otherwise, I don't think they would be in that position. But again, also speaking to staff, because maybe a chief librarian has a political agenda, so they might not, let the staff know, oh, this group talked to me, so just growing a general awareness. And then the library board, like, you can ask to speak at a library board. Library boards, I believe, their role is policy making. And they certainly care very much about the community. That's how they draft their policies. So going in and discussing with them, and again, like, sort of busting that myth, what they see those protesters as, I think educating them would go a long way, personally. Yeah.
Hi, first of all, thank everyone for a very informative evening. 2 questions as well. First of all, you talked about the opportunity to have books reconsidered. I'm wondering if there's any books that you have a very difficult time keeping on the shelf. So rather than going through the process, people just consider taking the book. So that's question number 1. And number 2 is, maybe each of you, if you could just comment, is there one book that you believe is widely banned or not shelved in libraries that you strongly disagree with, that you believe it should be on the shelves?
Go ahead.
Well, let me go back to something that comes back a little bit from the previous question, and I think all my colleagues are thinking about that one book. I'm certainly.
What is the gross book? I want to know.
Well, no. So it's one of Douglas Murray's books. So
Okay.
it's the one about gender. Yeah, but that one. See, essentially the entire output of Douglas Murray. If you go to an academic library, it'll be the rare library that will have it. So we're talking about output that comes in, or Deborah So even. And Deborah So is an academic. She's a bona fide academic. She has a PhD in what is it, neuroscience, I believe. It is, in fact, if we go back to such luminaries, let's say U of T made luminaries as Jordan Peterson, that is Voldemort. Peterson is Voldemort. You go anywhere on the U of T campus and you mention Jordan Peterson, you will actually get stares. It is. I don't know how many people read Maps of Meaning. Maps of Meaning is yay thick. It's about a 600 to 800 page long book that is incredibly layered with deep theory. And if people who think that Jordan Peterson is the poster boy for right-wing ideology even get to chapter 2 or 3, they'll realize that he's actually questioning the idea of an reality existing beyond that of the observer, which again would strike many people as not particularly right-wing thinking, right? Jordan Peterson, when you get him at where he lives, is, or at least was on these topics, an extremely nuanced thinker, and yet you will not find any other books by Jordan Peterson anywhere in U of T's libraries. Now, I would like to buy them. I don't see a good fit into a lot of the courses because my mandate when I buy books is that they do have to fit into what we teach. So unlike the dinosaur that I am, I cannot really buy the universe of knowledge production, at least even as it pertains to the courses that we teach. I have to be a lot more careful and circumspect, but let's say the fact that Peterson was for a long time psychology faculty at U of T still does not play into the fact that we would automatically carry his books that are more popular. In fact, we don't. And if one of us proposed to do so, we would be censured actually by our colleagues. And in that way, to come back to the previous question by your colleague there on the side, what is it that we're doing or not doing when we're not buying certain books? I think if we become too prone to the kind of activist thinking, or if we become too afraid, we actually give up on one of our key missions of being the advocate for the silent majority. Those who are activists are already advocating very loudly for themselves. We should advocate for those who don't have the background or don't have the freedom, or in some cases take away their own freedom or permission to come and advocate for those books.
I'll just, going back to that first question, we talked about the potential of people who disagree with a particular book of just sort of borrowing all the copies and keeping them forever. And that's a myth, that's an urban myth that's out there. It may have occurred, but I don't have any personal experience with it. But just to give a sort of a counterpoint to what Joanna was saying about one book. So one of the things that I still look upon as a positive thing is that in large measure, public libraries in Canada have very well resisted the efforts to remove books or to censor them or whatever. So in fact, I don't think I have an answer to that question because typically there has been quite a lot of efforts expended to stand our ground, so to speak. I wonder though, and I wish I'd remember the title of it, but there is a small press or self-published book that recently was published that's about the Freedom Convoy, and some of you probably know that our major bookstore chain decided that we would make it available, but it wouldn't be in any of our actual stores on display, despite the fact that it's one of the top 10 issues probably that Canadians or at the time were thinking of. And I have noticed, because at the time, and I wish I could remember the title, I would look it up, that very few libraries carried it. As well.
It's just called The Freedom Convoy by my colleague Andrew Lawton, and
there you go.
Ken White's Sutherland House Books actually put it out.
Thank you, yeah. And so I kind of wonder a little bit about that one. One of the observations about that bookstore chain, and I won't name them, was that a commentator made was clearly the bookstore chain knows its customers, right? Which is kind of sad to think that the bookstore chain is not, which is national in scope, is not trying to serve all Canadians, right? But there are certain people that buy books and there are certain people that don't, right? So that's maybe the decision that they were making there. But I wonder about that particular one in libraries, and I'm not sure.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out something that Chapters Indigo is actually a scented candle store that sells books and not a bookstore that sells scented candles. I have a different experience than Joanna. And I should say also with Sutherland, the publisher, and this is a totally library type thing, but one of the problems is they don't actually own American distribution rights for many of their books. And this has caused this causes headaches for me because our distributors for the companies that sell us the books at the university library will not carry Sutherland because it's an American firm and they need a company that you can sell the books on both sides of the border. And so it causes a lot of trouble. So I have to actually order, and I went through and I ordered every single book, nonfiction book from Sutherland House, or pretty much. I think there's 2 exceptions, but I bought everyone, including Andrew Lawton's book for our library. And I actually our library actually owns both Jordan Peterson's latest books as well. So I find it strange that they wouldn't have it at U of T. But
to be fair though, we had the first one, and now that I think about this, I think this is one of the ones we cannot keep on the shelf. As I personally replaced a copy, and I think that one's gone AWOL as well. The second one, I don't think I bought yet. Because I'm now in a different role. In theory, I shouldn't be buying books anymore, and I can't convince any of my colleagues to do so. But actually, I haven't had that conversation because I think the Voldemort thing comes up more often than not. But I'm glad you bought all of them. No, but you know what? What a good question, because it actually made me remember that one of them just wants to stay on the shelf.
But the bigger problem at the university libraries is people never take the books out at all, because we have 1 million books, and some of them sit on the shelf for 40 years. We had a new barcode system we introduced in the early 80s, and there's still quite a few books that haven't been taken out since the barcode system was introduced, because it causes a whole system issue, and they have to connect the barcodes to the record. And whenever they do that, nobody's taken it out since 1980. And it's more common than you imagine. So books just get left on the shelf. So if anybody takes a really controversial book out multiple times, I hope some of my colleagues will be impressed and say, wow, one of our books actually got used. Because that's certainly, that's a university problem. Public library, obviously, totally opposite.
So I wanted to I wanted to sort of test the idea of heterodoxy with an extreme example, and I'm curious about how you, as librarians, would deal with that. And let's say we're talking about a counterfactual book that we know is bullshit, but it's out there. People are talking about it, like Robert Faurison's Holocaust denial book. Would you keep that in your library? How would you deal with that? Is it better to have that and allow there to be speech around both things, or are the politics just too dangerous to touch?
I'll just put one thing in there. For me, the first question is does it have an actual publisher that's like decent? Because if it was self-published or self-published like book, because there's some books where like one person owns the publishing firm and also wrote the book, and in that case,
I don't think so. I think there was a publishing house, and Noam Chomsky actually wrote the introduction, for which he was slammed for.
That's weird.
So
yeah,
it wouldn't be that it wouldn't be that idea.
If it was like a proper publisher and the author like was semi-reputable and it fit the collection, and I thought somebody would be interested in it, I might get it, but it would be, I'd have to, like, did anybody review it? Like, was there a good review? Like, these are the types of questions I would ask before, especially for a book like that, because I keep doing that. I feel very liberal, so I think people should be able to deny the Holocaust publicly, and I think in our country now it's illegal to actually deny the Holocaust. So I will not deny the Holocaust here tonight and get arrested.
No, thank you.
But on the other hand, I think Holocaust denial is repugnant. So I sort of feel, I feel like personally pulled in both directions. So for me, it would be entirely a question of professional reasoning for why that book belongs or doesn't belong. So I don't know if that answers it, but maybe somebody else has a better idea.
I was just going to say, just so that you're all comfortable, I'm asking this question actually as a Jewish person who does believe in, freedom of expression and whatever, and someone with very deep connections to that community, and a real understanding of why people are against Holocaust denial and why it's an issue in Europe, and that there are some harms and the issues of anti-Semitism. But I ask that question because I, as a liberal, also believe that the best remedy for bad speech is better speech. So I am curious how you handle a political football. And I can tell you that I've had this discussion with Jewish friends, and I've been yelled at and accused of all sorts of things. But that is where I lie. And I should say that in a place like Israel, you can get those books, and they do have those discussions. So I find it interesting in Canada that, maybe because of our politeness, we have a difficult time talking about those difficult issues. So anyway, my question again, I don't know if that makes you feel more comfortable answering it, but there it is.
I can take a stab at it a bit. I don't want to preface everything by this is a repugnant idea, but it is one of the most repugnant ideas out there, right? But one of the questions would be to go back to some of those criteria. I tend to think that it would be very difficult, if not impossible, to write a good book with that perspective, and like a book that actually meets our criteria, right? I think it actually might, it may come across as not just disinformation, but misinformation. So a deliberate attempt, the other way around, a deliberate attempt to flood flood everything with the shit. But I also think that the chances are it wouldn't meet any of those criteria, including the public's desire for it, right? And again, that's a reflection, right? It is a radioactive topic for pretty much all Canadians. Not a bad thing in this particular case. But I also think that, and one thing we didn't talk about was, right, CFLA often says that the only thing that could restrict speech rights in Canada is the courts. And there is a hate speech provision in the criminal code, and I won't quote from it. It sets a very high bar, right? It's possible that book might meet that bar. But I also think at the same time that, so there is a recent hate speech conviction in Canada for some Toronto residents who produced a newspaper called Your Ward News, which, hit a lot of those hot buttons. I have to admit, though, every time I mean, I've not read Your Ward News, but every time I read about what it talked about and I read about the people who published it and wrote it, I actually have a hard time understanding that they could do harm because they were so laughably stupid, really. And that's kind of now the bar is so high that any idea spoken in earnest with any evidence would never meet it. But
I'll jump in quickly. We do have a number of courses in some of the departments of the university that deal with both genocide and studying genocide. We have a forensic science program that deals with mass murder and genocide. We have programs that talk about communication, miscommunication, malcommunication. I can see, so I don't have experience with that particular book, but I have dealt with and bought books dealing with forgeries, Shroud of Turin, genocide, forensic investigations in former Yugoslavia, issues that can be easily seen as both disturbing and in some cases somewhat politically charged, although nowhere near to the book that you've brought up. I have bought them because they serve a purpose, and in some cases I've defended buying them, even though some people saw them as gross, once again, because they're teaching materials and you cannot teach some of these subjects without them, so yes.
Well, I think maybe we'll wrap the formal portion of the evening, but maybe our panelists, one or two, will be sticking around if you want to chat with them for a minute or two.
Some of us might be going out for drinks later, which is, and I don't think we'd be very picky who shows up for our event, our drinking night. But
so thank you very much to Robert, Amy, Joanna, and Todd, and thank you for the. And thank you for the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship for supporting this evening. And thank you for attending.